Wyoming Territory, late spring of 1876. The woman stepped barefoot through the sagebrush and broken stone, her feet torn raw, her arms wrapped tight around her ribs like she was the only thing keeping herself from falling apart. The wind caught her hair filthy, matted, too tangled to tell what color it once was, and tossed it around her hollow face. She had no name, just scars. Scars on her wrists, her back, her legs. Scars from ropes, from fire, from men. From the rise above the creek, the cowboy saw her come stumbling into the open like a ghost. He had been hauling water from the stream to his horses when he spotted her, nothing but bones and bruises under a torn dress, every step like it cost her something. His name was Thayer Oakes, 31. Quiet, worked cattle and kept to himself. He had seen every kind of man, woman, and beast pass through these hills, but he had never seen anyone look so far past gone. She collapsed right there at the edge of the water. By the time Thayer got to her, she was barely breathing. He crouched down, slow, talking gentle. "Miss, you hurt bad." She flinched when he touched her shoulder, her eyes snapped open. Mud brown, wild. "I ain't gonna hurt you," he said, voice steady. "You're safe now, all right." She did not speak. Just stared up at him like she did not know what safe meant. Thayer lifted her in his arms. She weighed less than a sack of feed and carried her back to the cabin. It was a modest place, 2 rooms, one for him and one filled with tools, tack, and the smell of horsehide and old pine. He laid her on his own bed, covered her with the quilt his mother had sewn before she passed, and set to boiling water. She did not give her name because she did not have one, not anymore. But she let him wash her wounds. She let him cut away the shredded dress and clean the gashes on her back. She did not cry when he poured whiskey over the worst of them. She did not make a sound. He left clothes on the chair beside the bed. A shirt of his, brown wool, too big. She changed when he stepped out. She stayed quiet that first day, and the next, but she ate, not much. A bit of cornbread, some stew. She looked at him when he spoke, and he could feel her watching when he moved through the house. Like she was trying to figure him out, waiting for the bad part. Thayer never pressed. He worked, fixed the fence, rode out to check the herd, gave her space. But every evening he left a bowl of food by the fire, and every morning the bowl was empty. On the 3rd morning she spoke. "What day is it?" He looked up from where he was splitting wood. "Wednesday." Her voice was hoarse. "What month?" "May." She stared at the wall. "I thought it was still winter." He set down the axe and walked to the porch, leaned against the beam. "You got a name?" he asked. She hesitated, then shook her head. Thayer nodded like he understood, because maybe he did. "All right. Well, you can borrow mine for now. Call yourself Oakes if anyone asks." She looked at him, startled. "I'm just saying," he added softly, "might help to belong somewhere." She blinked, looked away, but she did not argue. That night she sat beside the fire instead of hiding in the bed. Wore one of his flannel shirts, sleeves rolled up, legs tucked under. Her skin was marked all over, old burns, welts, bruises not yet faded, but there was something strong in the way she held herself. She had not broken, not all the way. "Why are you helping me?" she asked. Thayer stirred the beans in the pot. "Because someone should have." She turned her face to the flames. Her throat worked like it hurt to keep the tears down. "I do not want to be scared anymore," he nodded. "Then stay." She looked at him, really looked, like she was trying to see if he meant it. If he was the kind of man who said things just to say them. He met her eyes, steady, open. "I got a spare bed," he said, "and a horse that needs brushing. You can ride once you're strong enough." She hesitated, then whispered, "I do not know how to ride." "Then I will teach you." Her eyes went glassy again, but she did not cry. She just nodded. The next morning she stood on the porch while the sun climbed over the hills. Her bare feet were planted firm on the boards, her arms crossed against the chill, but her face was lifted to the sky like she was breathing for the first time. Thayer was in the corral, working with a filly that had a temper. He caught sight of the woman, his woman now, at least in the way a man claims a stray soul by offering warmth and shelter, and something shifted in his chest. Later that day, she asked for soap. He gave her a bar and filled a tin tub with water warmed on the stove. She scrubbed for an hour. When she came out, her hair dripping down her back, he saw that her eyes were not just brown. They had flecks of gold in them, and her lips were fuller than he had noticed before. She looked young, maybe 22, maybe less. "You got a name you used to use?" he asked gently. She hesitated. then said, Tess. Tess what? She shrugged. I do not remember, he nodded. Tess Oakes then, she smiled, just a little, but it was real. Over the next few weeks, Tess began to move like she belonged. She helped with the chickens, learned how to grind feed, swept the floor without being asked. She still flinched sometimes, still woke up gasping on the worst nights, but she stopped shrinking from his touch. Let her hand brush his when she passed him coffee. Stood beside him close enough to feel his heat. Then one night, during a late rainstorm, the roof started to drip. Thayer went up with a lantern to patch it. She followed without a word, handing him tools, steadying the ladder. When he slipped on the slick boards, she caught him by the arm and cursed under her breath. You all right? She asked, heart pounding. He looked at her through the rain. Yeah, thanks to you. They stood there, soaked, laughing just a little, and then she leaned forward and kissed him. Just a brush of lips, hesitant, but it was enough to crack something wide open. He caught her face in his hands and kissed her back, deeper, slower, like he was memorizing the taste of hope. Her fingers curled in his shirt, her breath hitched, but she did not back away. When they pulled apart, she whispered, I want to stay. Thayer touched his forehead to hers, then stay. And she did. The first time Tess touched a horse, her hands trembled. It was late afternoon, clouds stretched thin across the sky, the kind of quiet light that made the Wyoming hills look softer than they were. Thayer had saddled the gentlest gelding he had, a buckskin with more patience than most men, and led him to the corral. Tess stood just outside the fence, arms stiff at her sides, watching like the animal might strike. He's yours for the hour, Thayer said, offering the reins. Name's Alder. Tess eyed the horse, then looked at Thayer. What if I do it wrong? You won't. He held the space between them with calm. And if you do, you'll learn. She stepped inside the fence. Her boots crunched against the dirt, and the horse flicked an ear at her but didn't move. Slowly, Tess reached out and touched his neck. The warmth surprised her. She traced the line of the mane, the slope of the shoulder, her face unreadable. You all right? Thayer asked. Tess nodded without looking up. He's warmer than I expected. Most things are once you let yourself near him. She didn't answer, but her hand stayed where it was. The lessons stretched into an hour, then two. Thayer showed her how to check the cinch, how to mount without startling. She fumbled, muttered under her breath, and once, when she slid halfway off and landed hard, she turned her face into the dirt and stayed there a moment too long. Thayer didn't move to help her, just waited. I'm not made for this, she said. Maybe not, he replied. But I've yet to meet a soul that came out the womb knowing how to ride. Tess pushed herself upright, wiped her palms on her thighs, and climbed back on. That night, she ate with a hunger she hadn't shown before. Not like she was starved, but like she finally had the appetite for living. Thayer noticed the way her posture had changed straighter, like her ribs weren't caved in anymore. She didn't speak much, but she was present in a way she hadn't been. After the plates were cleared, she stood by the window, watching the last of the light sink behind the hills. I used to think I'd die in the dark, she said. Someplace no one would ever find me. Thayer stirred the ashes in the stove, not looking up. You didn't. I know, her voice was quiet, but it still feels that way sometimes, like I'm not out yet, just paused. He set the poker aside and stood. Then let's keep walking. One step's better than none. She turned to him, the fire catching in her eyes. You don't ask much, do you? Not unless I'm owed it. Tess smiled, not the kind that flickered and faded, but something slower, steadier. The next morning, she woke before the sun. The bed was cold beside her, Thayer already gone to the barn. She pulled on her boots, not bothering with laces, and stepped outside. The air was sharp, dew heavy across the grass. She followed the path he'd worn into the earth, down past the tool shed and toward the sound of hooves. He was hauling hay, shirt sleeves rolled to his elbows, sweat already darkening the collar. He didn't turn when she approached. I want to help, she said. Thayer set the pitchfork down and faced her. You sure? I need to feel useful, he nodded, then handed her a bucket. Start with water. They drink more than you'd think. They worked side by side, wordless but not silent. Tess learned the rhythm of the place, the creak of the gate, the way the barn doors stuck if not lifted just right. Her palms blistered, but she didn't complain. That evening, she sat on the porch, arms wrapped around her knees. Thayer joined her, handing over a tin cup. You don't say much about where you're from, he said. No point in it, she replied. It's not where I'm going, still. Sometimes it helps talking. Tess traced the rim of the cup with her thumb. There was a man. He found me when I was 16, said I owed him for keeping me fed. I stayed because I didn't know where else to go. Thayer didn't interrupt. He traded me for a mule and 2 rifles last year. Didn't even look back. Her voice was flat, but her grip on the cup was tight. He won't come here, Thayer said. I know, but I still hear him when I sleep. Thayer leaned back in the chair, letting the silence stretch. You're not his anymore. Tess looked at him, her eyes clearer than he'd ever seen them. No, she said, I'm not. They sat until the stars came out. Later, when they lay in bed, Tess shifted closer. Her fingers found his under the quilt, hesitant but sure. He didn't speak, just let her settle against his chest. For the first time since she'd arrived, her breathing stayed steady through the dark. The garden behind the cabin had not been touched in years. The soil was dry, full of root rot and old onions gone soft in the ground, but Tess stood there with her sleeves rolled and a rusted spade in one hand. Spring rain had passed through the night before, loosening the dirt just enough to coax her into trying. Thayer came up from the barn with his hat tipped low. You thinkin' of growin' something out there? I am, she said. Something that comes back. He leaned against the post, arms crossed. Beans do all right if the frost holds off. Squash too if you don't mind them tackin' over. I don't mind. She knelt and pressed her fingers into the soil. It feels different when you choose what you grow. He watched her for a moment, then said, I can bring back seed from town. There's a store off the main road, run by a woman with a voice like a saw. She'll talk your ears off, but she gives fair measure. Tess gave a faint nod, not smiling, just focused. Her hands were already dark with earth. Later that day, a rider passed through. A man Thayer knew in the way ranchers know each other by reputation and borrowed tools. Name was Caleb Dow. He brought a wagon of feed to trade, and Tess stayed on the porch while the men talked across the hitching rail. Caleb's eyes flicked toward her. You tackin' on help now? Thayer didn't answer right away. Not help, he said finally, just mackin' room where it's needed. Caleb scratched his jaw, then shrugged. Well, there's worse things than company. When he rode out, Tess came down the steps, arms folded. He knew, Thayer nodded. Let him guess what he wants. You're nobody's business but your own. She looked toward the trail Caleb had taken, then back to Thayer. You worried someone'll come asking? No, he said. And if they do, they'll find me here. That night, Tess stitched a tear in Thayer's shirt while he lit the lamp. Her needle moved in even strokes, and the cotton thread caught the light when it passed through. You sew like you were taught by someone who cared, Thayer said. My mother, Tess didn't look up. She died before I turned 10, but she showed me how to keep things together. He poured water into the basin and sat on the edge of the bed. She'd be proud. I don't think she got to be proud of much. You're still here. Tess set the shirt aside. So are you. The quiet between them thickened, not heavy but close. She crossed the room and sat beside him. Her knee brushed his, and he didn't move away. I used to hate the sound of boots, she said. Now it means someone's coming home. Thayer looked at her sideways. You think you'll stay come summer? She hesitated. I want to. You don't owe me anything, Tess. I know. That's why I want to. He reached for her hand, and she let him take it. Her fingers were calloused now, rough in places where they'd once been torn. I never knew what peace felt like, she said softly. Not until you. He didn't answer. Just lifted her hand to his lips and held it there for a long while. The next morning, she rose before him and made coffee. It was too strong, but he drank it anyway. Will you teach me to read? She asked over the rim of her cup. Properly, I mean, I know my letters, but not much more. Thayer blinked at her, then nodded. We got a Bible and a seed catalog. That's enough to start. She pulled a stool beside the table, already ready. By afternoon, she could sound out the names of every vegetable she meant to plant. When Thayer saddled his horse to ride into town 2 days later, she packed a cloth bag with biscuits and dried apple slices. He kissed her temple before mounting up, and she touched his sleeve before he turned away. Don't be long, she said. I won't. She watched him ride out, dust rising behind him, and then turned back toward the garden. The first row was already planted. She watered it slow, careful not to drown the seeds. That evening, a storm rolled in from the west, thunder low and slow like a warning. She lit the lamp and sat by the window, waiting. When the wind began to rattle the shutters, she went to the stove and stirred the stew she'd started earlier. She didn't know when he'd be back, but she wanted the place warm when he walked in. Thayer returned past dusk, soaked through, carrying a satchel of seed packets and a folded newspaper. His coat dripped onto the floor and his boots stuck in the entryway mud, but Tess didn't care. "You bring the rain with you?" she asked, taking the bag. "Seemed to follow me the whole way back." She opened the satchel, pulling out carrots, pole beans, a few potatoes. At the bottom was a book, thin, leather-bound, worn at the corners. "What's this?" "Primer," Thayer said. "Figured you'd want more than a catalog." She ran her hand over the cover, then looked up. "Thank you." He stepped closer, brushing the damp from her cheek with the back of his hand. "You're building something here, Tess. I just want you to have what you need to keep it." She leaned into his touch. "I have everything I need," she said, "and I'm not going anywhere." The calf had wedged itself under a fallen cottonwood near the river's bend, its leg caught between root and stone. Thayer found it by sound. A thin bleating carried on the wind, and he worked the limb free with careful hands, murmuring low to keep the animal calm. By the time he returned to the cabin, dusk had worn the sky down to ash, and Tess was standing by the fence with a bundle of cloth under one arm. "You tear something?" he asked, nodding toward the bundle. She held it out. "I made you a shirt." He didn't take it right away. "You ever done that before?" "No," she admitted, "but I took apart one that didn't fit and followed its bones." Thayer unfolded it slow. The stitching wasn't perfect, but it held. The fabric was light chambray from the bolt he'd brought home last week. He ran a thumb over the seams. "You've got hands that remember more than they should." Tess looked down at her boots. "I needed to prove I could make something that wasn't just to survive." He set the folded shirt over his shoulder and reached for her other hand. "You don't owe me proof." "I know, that's why I wanted to try." They stood quiet for a beat. The air smelled of cottonwood sap and wet grass, and somewhere near the barn, a whip-poor-will called once, then fell silent. Inside, Tess lit the lamp and opened the primer he'd given her. She traced each word with her fingertip, lips moving in silence. Thayer watched her from the table, sharpening a blade with slow, even strokes. "Did you always live out this far?" she asked without looking up. "No," he said. "Started near Laramie. My father tried running cattle on someone else's land. It didn't end right." She looked over. "What happened?" "Papers were forged. He didn't know. They took the herd, burned the house. He left not long after. I was 17. "Where'd he go?" Thayer set the blade down. "North. I never saw him again." Tess closed the book and folded her hands. "You ever think about finding him?" "No." "Some men carry too much of their own ruin. He wouldn't have wanted a witness." She nodded once, slow. "I understand that." The stove crackled as a coal settled. Outside, rain began to patter soft against the roof. Tess stood and crossed to the window. "There was a grove near where I was kept," she said. "Aspens. In spring, the wind made them sound like water." Thayer didn't speak, just waited. "I used to sit under them when I could sneak away. I told myself if I ever left, I'd find a place with trees like that." She turned to him. "There aren't any aspens here." "No," he said. "But there's seedling bundles that come through Fort Fetterman each spring. Takes years, but they grow." Her eyes lifted, more curious than hopeful. "You'd plant trees for me." "I'd plant whatever you need to feel rooted." She crossed the room, slow. When she reached him, she rested her hand over his. "I'd like to build something that lasts," she said. "You are." He stood and kissed her forehead, then her temple, then lower still. Her breath caught not from fear, but from the weight of being wanted without cost. They lay down that night without rush, without silence, without hesitation. Her palm on his chest, his arm curved around her back, and for the first time she let herself sleep facing him. In the morning, Tess rose first. She pulled on her boots and stepped outside, the sun not yet over the ridge. The garden rose had sprouted. Tiny green spears, barely visible but there. She crouched and pressed her finger into the soil, testing the damp. A bird called from the fence post, a meadowlark, and she looked up, eyes scanning the sky. Behind her, the door creaked. Thayer stepped onto the porch, hair still sleep-mussed, shirt unbuttoned halfway. "They came up," she said. He squinted into the light. "Told you they would." She stood, brushing dirt from her knees. "I want to build a root cellar for what we grow. And maybe add a third room." Thayer leaned against the post. "You thinking of staying through winter then?" I'm thinking of staying every winter." He smiled, not wide, not loud, but something settled in it. "In that case," he said, "we'd best start digging before the frost comes back." Tess crossed the yard to him and rested her forehead against his chest. "I never thought I'd be part of anything," she whispered. "You are now," and she believed him. Not just because he said it, but because he'd never once asked her to be anything but herself. The cellar took them nearly 3 weeks to dig. Tess moved with a focus Thayer had come to know, methodical, spare, and steady. She measured each shovel's bite with her boot, kept the walls square, and lined the pit with stone she hauled up from the riverbank one basket at a time. By the second week, her back ached deep into the night, but she never once asked Thayer to stop. One morning, while setting the final course of stones, she paused and looked up at the ridge. "There's a stillness here," she said, "like the land's listening." Thayer rested his hands on the shovel. "It is, always has been." She nodded once, then bent back to the work. By mid-June, the cellar was done, capped with a cedar hatch Thayer had cut and planed himself. They packed it with root vegetables, jars of early jam, and sacks of flour wrapped tight in canvas. Tess stood at the edge of it that afternoon, hands on her hips, sweat darkening her collar. She didn't smile, but her chin lifted just slightly. That same day a letter arrived. Thayer brought it from the post road, folded into the pocket of his coat. He handed it to Tess without a word, the seal cracked but the pages neat. She took it with both hands, sat beneath the cottonwood near the corral, and read it through once before folding it on her lap. "It's from a circuit judge," she said. "One of the men who passed through the place I came from." Thayer crouched beside her, his hands resting on his knees. "He says they found the man who sold me." Her voice was steady, but her grip on the paper tightened. "He's been sentenced. 10 years hard labor. It's done." Thayer said nothing, just watched her face. "I thought I'd feel something sharper," she said. "But all I feel is tired. That's the weight coming off." She let out a slow breath. "If I'd known peace would feel like this, I think I'd have run sooner." "You weren't meant to run," he said. "You were meant to arrive." That night, they sat on the porch after supper, the sky low with clouds and the scent of sage in the air. Tess sipped from her cup, then set it aside. "I've been thinking about the land east of the pasture," she said. Thayer tilted his head. "The flat stretch near the creek bend. There's good soil. If we fenced it proper, we could keep a milk cow, maybe a few goats." "You planning to keep me too busy to notice winter coming?" "I'm planning to stay," she said. "And I want a life that grows." He reached over and took her hand, rough fingers curling around hers. "You already made one." They married that August beneath the cottonwood, just the two of them and the preacher from town, whose mare had gone lame halfway up the trail. He arrived walking, boots caked in river mud, but Tess didn't mind. She wore a dress she'd sewn from muslin, dyed pale with black walnut hulls, and carried a bundle of dried wildflowers she'd gathered from the hills beyond the garden. Thayer wore his best shirt, the one she'd stitched, and a look in his eyes that made her chest ache with something too full to name. The preacher kept his words brief. Tess and Thayer spoke their own vows in voices too quiet for anyone but each other. When it was done, and their hands were bound in a length of ribbon Tess had saved from her mother's trunk, the preacher tipped his hat and left them to it. They didn't celebrate with music or guests. Instead, they walked the ridge above the house, where the wind tugged at the grass and the hawks circled far overhead. "You ever think this would happen?" she asked. "No," he said. "But I hoped." She turned to him, the ribbon still around their hands. "You waited for me." "I didn't know I was waiting," he said, "until you came walking out of the hills." The sun dipped low. Shadows stretched long across the fields. That night they lay in their bed with the windows open, the air warm, and the quilt folded at their feet. Tess traced the line of his collarbone, her fingers slow and sure. "I used to think I was nothing more than what had been done to me," she said. "You're more than anything I've ever known," he answered. She rested her head against his chest, heart steady against his ribs. "I want children," she said. Thayer's hand came to rest on her back. "Then we'll make a place for them. I want them to know what quiet love looks like, what safety feels like. They will." Years passed. The orchard they planted behind the barn bore fruit by the 5th season. Apples first, then plums. The goats Tess insisted on brought milk and mischief in equal measure, and the garden grew wide enough that they bartered produce for cloth and sugar with the town's dry goods store. In the spring of the 7th year, Tess gave birth to a daughter. They named her Clara, after no one, just a name that felt like a beginning. Tess held her in the crook of her arm beneath the same cottonwood where she'd once read the letter that closed a chapter of her past. Thayer built a cradle from pine, its corners smooth and polished. He placed it beside their bed, where they could hear the girl breathe through the night. Tess raised Clara with the same quiet strength that had carried her through the worst of her life. She read to her from the primer Thayer had once given her, now softened with years and thumb worn along the spine. There were hard winters, dry summers, days when the well needed mending and the barn roof leaked. But there was never a time when the house felt empty. Never a time when Tess didn't know her place in the world. She kept her old scars, but they faded. Thayer aged with the grace of someone who had found his purpose and held it with both hands. His hair went silver at the temples first, then across his beard. He still rose before dawn, kissed Tess's shoulder before leaving the bed, and brought her coffee with honey when the days turned cold. They stayed in that house until the porch steps wore thin, until Clara had children of her own who ran through the same grass where Tess had once stood, unsure of the ground beneath her feet. And when Thayer and Tess sat side by side in the twilight of their years, their hands still found each other without thinking. They built a life from the ashes of two broken pasts, steady and kind, rooted deep in the Wyoming soil, and nothing, not time, not silence, not memory ever shook it loose.